Good evening, everyone. I'd like to take a minute to welcome everybody to tonight's presentation. Just as a quick reminder, please make sure that all your cell phones are on silent or off. I want to take a couple minutes to acknowledge a couple of our guests this evening. Professor Farah, who is the faculty advisor to the Business Club. Dr. Timur, Chair of Business Administration and Public Relations. Andy Hill of Investment Advisors. President of Hodges, Terry McMahon. We're going to basically, I want to remind everyone at the end, there are some little cards and some pens on the tables that you can use for questions and answers. We will have a moderator that will be able to facilitate the question and answer period when Mr. Liesman is done presenting. I'll turn it over right now to Andy Hill for some opening remarks.
Thank you, Belinda, and it looks like we have a great audience tonight to hear Steve Leisman speak. A little introduction of how I met Steve. We all have hobbies in life, and it's very important that we develop those, because I called Steve, I don't know, a couple times, and I finally left a message about going fishing several years ago, and then, well, he ended up participating in a fishing tournament in the area, and then I called him. I think we even, Terry and I had spoken to him about coming to Hodges for something or another, and we found an event. And I don't think it could be more appropriate to have him speak before the business school students at Hodges. The issues that Steve has been on the front line of, from the financial crisis to the recovery to numerous other issues for many years that he's covered economics for CNBC, I think he's going to share with you observations that is very difficult to share with you. So with that introduction, I thank Steve for coming to Naples to address these issues. I know he's very enthusiastic about speaking with students, especially with Hodges students being a little of a non-traditional and adult learner. It's unique from a number of the institutions that he has spoken at before. So with that, I'll turn it back to Belinda. Thank you for coming tonight.
I'm going to read a short bio. As CNBC's senior economics reporter, Steve Leisman reports on all aspects of the economy, including the Federal Reserve Bank and major economic indicators. He appears on Squawk Box as well as other CNBC programs throughout the business day. Leisman joined CNBC from the Wall Street Journal, where he served as a senior economics reporter covering monetary policy, international economics, academic research, and productivity. At the Wall Street Journal, Liesman previously worked as an energy reporter and from 1996 through 1998 as the journal's Moscow bureau chief. He was a member of the reporting team recognized in 1999 with the Pulitzer Prize for stories chronicling the crash of the Russian financial markets. He received the first runner-up award in the 1998 SAIA Novartis Prize for International Reporting for the four-part series, Markets Under Siege. This prize recognizes outstanding achievement in the coverage of international affairs. Prior to joining the journal in 1994, Liesman was the business editor for the Moscow Times, where he, as the founding business editor for the country's first English language daily newspaper. He helped create the publication Stock Index, which was the country's first. Liesman has also worked as a business reporter for both the St. Petersburg Times in St. Petersburg, Florida, and the Sarasota Herald Tribune in Sarasota, Florida. Liesman holds a master's degree from Columbia University Graduate School of Journalism and a bachelor's degree in English from the State University of New York. We are so excited and honored to have Steve Leisman here with us tonight at Hodges University. Please help me welcome Mr. Liesman to the stage.
Can you hear me okay? Thanks for that lovely introduction. Wondering who the hell you were talking about there. And Andy, you didn't tell me this was going to say informative evening. I just thought an evening. I thought we were just supposed to do that. I recently got a letter from somebody. It was an anonymous letter. Actually, the guy's name was on it. And he said, Steve, I just want to thank you for a terrific forecast you made. When I met you in Jackson Hole in 2009, I asked you when the market would hit an all-time high. You said your birthday in May 2013. I said, and I could not recall at all making that call, but he said, close enough, nice job with that. I don't tend to make many predictions, and it reminded me of a joke, which is a joke, but it's actually a true story. Probably a good way to start would be just one of my favorite books about economics is Against the Gods by Peter Bernstein. Have you guys read this book? Anything by Peter Bernstein, you should just go out and read. One of the most understandable guys, and that's the remarkable history of risk, how humankind grew up to be able to assess and understand and price risk. And it talks about a gentleman named Kenneth Arrow who goes on to win the Nobel Prize for Economics. And it just occurs to me that one of the things that's interesting about Kenneth Arrow is Kenneth Arrow would, among other things, write papers about derivatives and the ability to hedge risk. Now, he didn't write about financial derivatives. He talked about a world where companies could go out and hedge the risk. But as Arlo Guthrie said in Alice's Restaurant, that's not what I came here to talk to you about. This particular story has Kenneth Arrow as in the meteorological department in World War II. And we didn't have satellites back in World War II, as many of you might know. We had like these balloon things, we put them up, and we get the shifting of the air, and we take the humidity readings, some temperature stuff, and they would forecast, like, if they were lucky, like a day or two ahead of time. But the High Command, and I think this was leading up to D-Day, decided they needed a long-range forecasting unit. So they took a bunch of these meteorologists, they put them in the long-range forecasting unit, and they kept coming up with forecasts, and they were always terrible. They were never even close to right. And these meteorologists petitioned the High Command and said, would you please put us back in our old unit so we could do at least some good? And a note came back, and this is what reminded me of this story, was a note came back from the High Command. The High Command is aware that the long-range forecasts are worthless. However, we still require them for planning purposes. And it's a true story. You'll read it in Peter Bernstein's book, Against the Gods, which is kind of funny. There's some, like, why do we do what we do? We have all these forecasts out there. And in part, it's because people require it. I mean, we're in the business that Andy does, financial planning, we need to do our best to understand the future. I don't know that economics does a particularly good job at it, but it almost doesn't matter. I am involved at CNBC in a lot of forecasts and surveys and stuff like that. And then, when I go to the meetings, the news meetings to present these forecasts, people say, are these guys right? And I say, it doesn't matter if they're right. But it really doesn't. It's funny because they're almost never right. In fact, when we ask people about their optimism or pessimism, a lot of times it's a contrary indicator, right? Is it a good time to invest in stocks? It's probably if they say yes, it's probably a bad time, or at least not as good as it was when everybody said it was a bad time. Andy on the way over was mentioning 666 on the S&P. I mean, that was a time to get involved in stocks. Now I think we might have an interesting discussion about that tonight. But what I tell them is what matters about these surveys is, well, this is what is priced into the market. That's the only reason we do these surveys or I even report on them. Because I don't really care if their predictions are correct. I want to know, is 3% GDP baked into the market now? Or is such that when GDP comes out at 2%, I know the market's disappointed and hasn't gotten the growth that it was after. But I've actually written a speech here, which is probably not good for you because I'm really not that great at presenting speeches. But I did have a bunch of thoughts that I wrote down, and I wanted to kind of share them with you and see what you guys thought. And it has to do with where we are right now as a country in thinking about our economic concepts and philosophy. And what I'm going to present here is this notion that in my lifetime, and maybe in yours, this is one of the most uncertain moments in terms of America's belief in the right economic ideas than it has been certainly since the 1970s. And I think it's a really interesting time to be engaged in thinking about the economy, because I think things are changing, and I think there's a natural experiment in front of us right now where stuff is happening that the people doing them, like at the Federal Reserve or the Treasury, could never have conceived of actually doing these things, but they're happening now. The $85 billion of purchases by the Federal Reserve never happened before. You know, the TARP never happened before, or not, at least, you know, maybe there's some comparable stuff in the 30s. And how this stuff works or not, the stimulus program, Keynesian economics being on the table. If you're engaged in thinking about the economy, this is an awesome time to be involved in it, because it's taking place less in the textbooks and more in the newspapers and in public debate. And so I guess I just urge you all to engage in that debate and think about it. And I want to give you sort of where I think we are and why we are where we are. My idea is that everything is sort of on the table now, from how much government to have, how much private sector, how much regulation, how much deregulation, and how much we have in the way of entitlements and how much we have in the way of taxation. And I don't know how much you've forgotten, but that was really not in question until the crisis. It was kind of decided. Probably forgot, but deregulation actually began under Jimmy Carter. Jimmy Carter started deregulation with the airline industry in like 1978. And I only bring that up to tell you that there had been this consensus, which some professors have called the Washington Consensus, which was Wall Street, Main Street, and Washington all believed that the best way to run the economy was to deregulate it and to have low taxes. Carter started a bit, but really Reagan would be the person you'd associate with that idea, and rightfully so. It continued under George Bush the first, continued under Clinton, where the financial industry was deregulated, and then also you know, some of the welfare reforms that happened under Clinton, which was a scaling back of government. So this was, when you think about the world today and how divided Republicans and Democrats are, there was this consensus that was almost 40 years in existence about how to run the economy. And I'm going to submit that three things have happened in the past 6 years or 5 years that have called that into question, pushing and pulling in different directions. So the first thing was the financial crisis. And now it's probably worthwhile to look at my notes here. It began in 2007, obviously exploded in 2008, and really shattered this notion of deregulation is good. And it's worth thinking about maybe why that happened. So really it began under Rubin, who was the Treasury Secretary for Clinton, this notion that the banking system, the financial system, could take care of itself. And what we have since learned is that that is not true. One of the most famous admissions by Greenspan, former Fed Chairman Alan Greenspan, in the wake of the crisis was that he messed up in thinking that two parties in a derivative contract, the market could regulate itself, that they would, one guy would look out for itself. What we missed and what we've since learned is that markets cannot internalize the systemic risk they create. It's easier perhaps to think about a factory. Factory's going to set itself up, and it's not going to think very much about the pollution it dumps into the water or the pollution that goes into the air. That's the job of government. It will never internalize that cost unless it's forced to. Now, obviously, there's some altruism on the part of factory managers and owners. I'm not saying that. But in general, that's what government does. So what we found was that we needed to force the banks and the financial system to internalize the systemic risk created by the term that everybody hopefully now knows, which is too big to fail. Banks that were out there that were so large that if they failed, the government would be forced to come in and rescue them. And indeed, that's what happened. So let's just put that on one side. The first element that I'm saying has called into question our thinking about our economic system as the financial crisis. 40 years of deregulation explodes in our faces and causes us to cause that into question. The second thing that comes along after that is the government's response to the crisis. Now, it'll be worthwhile, I think, later to have a discussion, did it work or did it not work? I happen to think it worked reasonably well. But I don't believe that was the general opinion of the public. I think the public saw an $800 billion stimulus plan that didn't create a whole lot of growth or jobs, and it saw a $700 billion TARP program that essentially gave money to the bankers and did not require them to reduce their salaries. So this is step two. Step two is that we have this situation where government does get more involved, but the public looks at it and says, you know what? I don't really like what I see when I see all that government spending. It hasn't created the jobs I thought it was going to create, and it hasn't created the growth I thought was going to be out there. So that pulls in a separate direction. Pardon me. And the third thing, which is not related to the crisis, is the aging of the population. Now, this has been going on forever, for a very long time. Since we reached the baby boom peak, which was my year, I think, which is 1963. Some people say it's 64, whatever year it was. All I know is that every year ahead of me, they were always firing teachers in anticipation of the class behind me, which was like 60 kids shorter or something like that, or 60 kids fewer than were out there. So, in fact, Alan Greenspan gave a really funny speech in Jackson Hole one year. He said, we don't know a lot that's certain about economics, but one thing we know for sure. The vast number of people who are 35 right now, in 30 years, will be 65. And what's funny is that always gets a laugh, and I'm always afraid nobody's going to laugh at that joke, but every time I tell that story, people laugh. And it's funny because it's really true, and from an economic standpoint, the thing that is inexorable, that is unavoidable, that is the only thing in this uncertain world we know is true, is that people are going to get older, and we can really estimate how long they're going to live. In fact, if you go read this Against the Gods book by Peter Bernstein, some of the first use of some of the math that is so common today, one of the first things we ever figured out how to do was to do actuarial tables. And that's why it happened, was insurance companies in England, I guess in the 18th century, I think it was, trying to figure out how to price insurance. And that you can follow that chain all the way down to the Black-Scholes model to price derivatives. But that's sort of how it started to happen. But what happened was there was this aging of the population going on, and we almost paid it no attention, in part because we had, something of an economic boom in the early part of the 2000s. It was okay. It wasn't off the charts, but it covered up what was happening. People were aging. The cost of their aging in both entitlements and Medicare was rising. And ultimately, when the crisis hit, it really pulled back the covers on what was going on. So today we look at something called the labor force participation rate, which is part of the debates we have about, is the unemployment rate really going down, or are people just dropping out of the workforce? And people are dropping out of the workforce, but they're dropping out for two reasons. The first one is that they're discouraged and they're not looking for work, so they are part of the people, ages who could be working, but they're not working, so they're counted as discouraged. The other part is that people reach an age, again, inexorably, mathematically, where they just work less. I wish I should have come with the data, but it's something along the lines of the 35 to 54 rate has a participation rate of something like 70 or 80%. When you get 55 and above, it's something like 55%, and when you get 65 and above, it drops even further. Now, more of these people are working more, but that doesn't overcome the general statistics that are out there. I think the participation rate, for example, in the 55 and older crowd has gone up by 2 or 3 percentage points. So you have more and more people in an older cohort who are working more, but they're still, in general, in a cohort where they work less, if that makes any sense. So What that means is that the participation rate is going down in ways that it hasn't in 50 or 60 years. Another thing happening that never happened before, because when we were all growing up in this room, huge numbers of women were entering the workforce. And that was raising the participation rate, and it really changed the dynamic in the economy. Now, people are leaving the workforce, and there's also actually a couple cohorts of people. There's a sort of inexplicable young cohort of people who have left the workforce that may be to go back to school. It may be because they're discouraged, and it's something that I think, Terry, is challenging our educational system. I was just in North Carolina doing a story about German companies in Charlotte that were working with community college to implement, community colleges in the area to implement apprenticeship and journeyman programs. It's kind of like moving away from liberal arts education and trying to get people, and I talk to more and more, this is probably bad to say it here, but more and more students who are really concerned about the debts they're leaving college with. And that's obviously a big issue we have right now. So I think that's another thing that's going on, is rethinking the liberal arts education. Pardon me. So that's our third element. And what does that third element do, the aging of the population? You may have a lot of ideas out there, principles that you may have about how the world should work, or how the government should work, or how much government involvement there should be. But I can tell you that the only possible conclusion from the aging of the population is bigger government and higher taxes. Now, I would add to that that one of the other conclusions is going to be that you will have some cuts in benefits, but overall, what I think people mistake, and maybe if you walk away with one thing tonight, and Professor, you just tell me if I'm wrong about this, okay? But this is how I have come, having racked my brain to understand both sides in this issue and understand all the great thinkers in economics. We try to think about economics in terms of like physics and other sciences. And there are some things out there that are like that. Like there's a really good relationship between the unemployment rate and growth. There are relationships between unemployment and inflation. But we don't have something where we can like take out an instrument and figure out exactly how far the sun is. We can't measure, gravity. We can't really measure things like the impact of tax cuts. It's all very uncertain. There are general ideas, and there's things we call optimal policy, the best possible policy. But what happens is optimal economic policy gets put in the blender that is Washington. And it comes out as sort of like, not so good ground meat. And part of the reason is because on the one hand you have optimal policy. Put that over here. On the other hand, you have a culture's norms, goals, and sense of itself. So when you think about what it is we should do, and you'll have some people say we should cut taxes to the very bottom and let the private sector go. That's a probably optimal policy. But then you come over here and say, okay, cut taxes, let the private sector go. Are we going to care for our poor and our elderly, and are we going to educate our children? This is the essential conflict of economics right here. Optimal policy versus a culture's desires and goals. And I will tell you that optimal policy that does not take into account a society's goals is not optimal. It has to be bent through that prism of what it is a society thinks of itself, which is why I'm telling you, because I believe America is a place that is going to care for the elderly and it's going to care for the poor at some level. And so when you have a huge and massive cohort of aging population, what's going to happen is we are going to direct the wealth of this nation to care for those people and provide them with something of a minimum of a living standard. I think that's true when it comes to health care. I think it's true for education, and I think it's true for retirement as well. I think those are three separate issues that will be dealt with separately. But if you have this population aging, the only outcome, I think, is going to be some cuts in entitlements, but also higher taxes. Now, another fabulous and weird thing about America is we have societal goals and culture about taxation, right? I mean, I thought George Bush, George H.W. Bush, the recent president, he said something that was at once completely non-economic, but in a sense the most beautiful economic phrase I've ever heard. He said, I don't think we should be taking more than 1/3 of people's income. Full stop. That was it. There is no economics behind that. It could be, because one of the things they teach as soon as you learn economics is if you say 28%, the next question is why not 27 and why not 29? Why 28? That's what they want to kind of teach you to do in economics. So he said 1/3. Why 1/3? Well, you know what? That's what felt right to him. Now, is that how we should be making economic policy? I hope it's a little more in-depth than that, but that's kind of like how we do it. 1/3. So when I tell you that taxes are going up and we're going to do it because of our cultural desires, there's a limit to how far those taxes will go up because of our cultural norms as well. What's happening right now is we are in the middle of a great conversation, but what's unfortunate about it is, in my estimation, we're not really having the conversation. What we're doing is having a conversation about the deficit. And the deficit is not the conversation to have. I believe the deficit is a euphemism, is a way of not having the conversation. It's like when you argue with your dad about politics, you're really arguing over something entirely different. It's just a proxy. But the problem is we don't have, I feel like at this moment, the language to have the conversation that we need to have. And the conversation is, what is the right amount of time that a person should work, given what's happened to life expectancy? And then how much are we going to spend in things like end-of-life care? And then how much are we going to tax the younger generation to pay for that? And at what point do we reach a taxation level that reduces incentives to work? I've urged some people to take what I'm calling the Thanksgiving dinner table dependency test. Next time you're at Thanksgiving, or right now, imagine your Thanksgiving table. And think about the people around it. How many people are working full-time? How many people are getting assistance from the government? How many are in school and how many are kids? I will tell you those ratios right now are drastically different from what they would have been 20 years ago, and even more different from how they were 40 years ago. These are the questions and challenges we have. I'm ultimately optimistic that we will arrive, as Churchill said, we will exhaust all other possibilities and eventually do the right thing. And I'm optimistic that if we don't go too far, I just want to say a quick word about health care. Very controversial, but again, a program that came out of a desire that I actually think both parties shared, believe it or not, this idea of insuring everyone. I think poorly executed. I think it's something we'll come back at to revisit. But again, it's going to be revisited in a context of, well, what is it that we want to do? And then, of course, can we pay for it? And I actually think they need to come back and revisit it. But I would say I don't think they're going to get rid of it. I think that once you've sort of opened that door to universal health care, I don't see that being rolled back. I would like the president to engage business in how to implement it in a way that doesn't create incentives not to hire, or that doesn't create economic drags. But I think it was really a plan that began again in a Republican presidency and then ultimately was executed by Obama in a way that obviously is very controversial. But I think that's an expression of a societal goal, and we'll see if that's right. I think the pendulum could shift back away from that a little bit, but I don't think it's going away. And I think that this election might have been in part about that. I think it was a pretty clear choice, but it did not get it did not get a majority, and I don't think that's. I mean, the Republicans have voted several times to repeal it, but they don't seem to be getting any help from the center. Maybe we could talk about what the center is in America anymore. I'm not really quite sure. But what I think is going to happen is they will come to some form of balance in terms of figuring these things out. It is interesting that we're having the conversation now, and it's really not a problem for now. The big problems come in 2020, 2030, and if we do actually get on something of a footing to resolve the deficit in the next 5 years or so, I think we're going to be okay. And the thing you don't want to do is be too pessimistic about the future. There's a famous economist named Malthus who was brilliant in a lot of respects, except for he screwed up one thing really badly. He projected that we were all going to starve. And what he did is he looked at population growth, and he looked at production, and he said, you know what, this gap, we're never going to feed the population. He completely discounted technology and the agricultural technology. In fact, there's this great book that posits that the single best invention of mankind, the one invention responsible for more people being on this earth, the Haber-Bosch complex, which created artificial nitrogen. And in the book it says there may be like 2 billion people on the earth because we have artificial nitrogen, which helps fertilize. It's crazy, right? But it's probably true in that the only ways you got nitrogen before was from lightning and from some little bacteria in the ground. And then this thing comes along, and it ended up being, when they had détente in China, the first technology the Chinese asked for was a Haber-Bosch complex nitrogen thing. So don't be too pessimistic. We got problems. A lot of the problems, though, let's put them in context. They're man-made, right? It's not a tsunami. It's not an earthquake, and it's not a sinkhole, to put it in terms you people in Florida might understand. No, I lived here, I know. One of the problems we have is we're living longer. So let's not be too pessimistic about that. I keep hearing people complaining about living longer. Now, I get that we have to figure out how to pay for it and that there's huge expenses associated with it, but if I could choose a problem, I think I like that one better than the other one, right, which is living shorter, right? Just a little bit of economic history. Until the Industrial Revolution, there was only 2 ways to grow per capita growth, which is how much wealth each individual person has: war and plague. In other words, we had to kill people to get richer. But now we have a way of enriching ourselves without killing people or without people dying. We have technological improvement and a whole bunch of other stuff we have going on. So that's not something that makes me, I know these are hard and intractable problems, but put them in context. The sequester, it's a man-made train wreck. It's not a train wreck that's like a real train wreck. It's a man-made train wreck. We came to agreement in '83 on the Social Security reform. There are possibilities for resolving Social Security. In fact, most guys say that if you put the Democrats and Republicans in the room 15 minutes, we could fix Social Security like that. You raise the retirement age, you do a couple things, a little twist. That's like the easy problem. You could probably make a lot of progress. I don't know how many people hate this idea with Medicare by raising the Medicare cap on that. That would probably help things along pretty well, at least give us additional time. And again, that's higher taxes, but it would be higher taxes on the wealthy, and I'm thinking some of you guys are in this room, so I'll just duck right now. So ultimately, I'm optimistic, and I think that one of the great things you can do is put all this stuff into context and think about when guys come along and tell you the world is ending, just be skeptical, because Art Cashin, who's a guy we have on CNBC quite a bit, my favorite quote probably of all times. He said, "The end of the world comes only once. It's a trade you have to time very carefully." Thank you. You want to do some questions now, or how do you want to do this?
I have a few items, Steve, that I thought would be of interest, and we'll get into. I'll start off with an easy one. That's kind of a fun, and then we'll get into some questions that'll be more like maybe an exam question for the economics students.
What about my favorite fly rod? That's the easy one.
Not quite.
Okay,
I
all right.
was thinking if you were going to create a fantasy finance team, who would you have on it?
To do what?
They're gonna
Help the.
Secretary of Treasury.
In other words, they're going to help.
Monetary policy, Federal Reserve.
You know, I like Bernanke. I think he's really smart, and I think he knows the topic of how to avoid Great Depressions and what the Fed did wrong in Great Depressions. I think it was kind of fortuitous we had him in the helm at that time. If I had to pick between Paulson and Geithner, Tim, a little bit more of his ear to the political ground. Hank, just an unbelievable deaf ear to politics, but knew finance incredibly well. It depends on when I was picking them for. If I'm picking them for a financial crisis, I'd pick Geithner, because Geithner was not shy about using government when he felt it was needed. Paulson more for after the crisis, because I think he's more of a, get the government out of the way kind of guy. I'd put Thomas Friedman somewhere in there because of his international perspective, the columnist for the New York Times. I like him. And I'd probably put him in a room with Paul Gigot, the op-ed editor for the Wall Street Journal. And I'd say, don't come out till you have a single line that I can read. That's the way I'd do it. I have other people I put on it, but I'll just leave it there. Those are, I mean, those are good thinkers. I mean, I think they're smart people. I like Marty Feldstein from who's the former head of the NBER, and Paterba, who's another guy you should listen to. We should have him on more. He's the current head of the National Bureau of Economic Research.
Okay. My business partner.
Oh, sorry, Richard Thaler.
Okay.
University of Chicago behavioral economist.
Ooh.
He's a brilliant guy.
We refer to
Richard Thaler determined in a story I'm working on now that all teams overpay when they draft the first round draft pick in the NFL, and that the best draft pick is the 27th. It provides and he has a whole concept called the loser's curse, or sorry, the winner's curse. I'll let you get to the next question in a second. The winner's curse is basically says that anybody who ends up making the final winning bid in an auction actually loses and overpays. Anyway, go ahead.
We know a little bit about auctions in this community during charity season.
Right, but you lose intentionally, right? I mean, that's the point.
A couple on the issues of behavioral economics. I have two issues. My business partner asked me, we're discussing questions for you today, and she wondered about does the media lead to overreactions and underreactions, or overhyping financial market trends?
I think so, and I think that there's an interesting interplay right now, probably between the media and computer trading, which is there are trading systems out there that trade on headlines. There's a whole lot of trade that happens when a piece of data comes out, and what's happened is there's been an agreement between the trading companies and the wire services that the headlines appear in a specific format that can be read by the black box trading programs. So this is not exactly to your point, but I'll get around to it in a second. Let's say the forecast is for 150,000 jobs to come out. The computer is programmed to read that headline once it comes out. And when I say once it comes out, I'm a lifetime later than the computer has actually already traded. That very phrase. Because we can talk about the timing on some of this stuff. It boggles the mind. To read this 150,000, or read the actual number, let's say it's 180, and it's 30,000 over, and there's a series of programs that in the time I do that, a series of trades that have already been executed that are tied to that headline that flashes over. Same thing with the media. When we go out and report stories, you create a momentum. The momentum is seen and sensed by the computers. I mean, there's this guy, Jim Simons from Renaissance. Does anybody know anything about this guy? Something like 30% returns forever. And nobody really knows exactly what he does, but what we think he does is trade minuscule differences in baskets of stocks, like 4,000 baskets. I just happen to know a guy, 4,000 stocks in a basket, and he's trading differences between those baskets. I know a guy who rented time on the Lawrence Livermore supercomputers to test his theory of what he thought Jim Simons was doing. And one other thing I know is that the price of real estate in a certain place in New Jersey has gone up because it's closer to the servers of the exchanges. So if you think about the speed of light, which is what this stuff is traveling in, that it makes a difference that you are 100 yards away or 1,000 yards away. And that's what's going on in the world. So the media, there are good reporters and bad reporters. There are reporters who know the stories and those who don't. And we sometimes get it wrong, and sometimes we hype things up beyond what they were. There are times we don't. I spend an awful lot of time myself telling people that certain things that were out in the market during the financial crisis were not true. And there were guys who were out there saying it was true. So yeah, we can make things worse. But what's going on in the market is like this megaphone on the news right now. And it creates a lot of volatility, and I don't know if it evens out in time.
Well, it's, and I believe you cover behavioral economics issues. We'll move on to a Fed policy question. On the right over, we discussed the issue that the U.S. dollar has been particularly strong this year, which is a change in a macroeconomic trend. That's giving some resilience to inflationary pressures from building. Does that, in effect, give the Federal Reserve more room and latitude to move forward with or continuing quantitative easing programs?
Yeah, and you guys get the concept, right? That if the dollar is worth more, then the cost of our imports are worth, they cost us less relatively, so that would be like importing deflation or putting less pressure, less inflationary pressure out there. I think in general, in the average American's mind, the importance of the value of the dollar is overstated. I like to think of America as the price maker, not the price taker. If I was a small country exporting for a living, I would be very concerned about the value of my currency. We actually buy a very large percentage of our total goods and services. Just remember I said goods and services, I mean, because we get an awful lot of stuff from China in the way of goods. But internally, we're less trade dependent than Britain, a lot of countries in Europe. I think the figure is something like 22%, whereas Britain is more like 27 or 30 or something like that. And what the dollar is what represents the price rather than, you know, it was interesting because there was a time when that may not have been true. If the euro hadn't fallen on its face, there might have been a rival to the dollar. But one of the most amazing parts of the experiment that's happened is you think about the day after the U.S. government was downgraded by Standard & Poor's, right? Our bond yields fell, our dollar strengthened. Okay, so everybody went running for cover into the very thing that had been downgraded. So the experience of the last 6 years, in terms of what's happened to bond yields, in terms of what's happened to inflation in this country, in terms of what's happened to the dollar, is the opposite, I would venture, from what you're hearing in the advertisements on AM radio. Okay, these are the guys peddling the apocalypse and doom. I am not here to peddle you apocalypse and doom. I think people have made a business out of peddling apocalypse and peddling doom, and I hope you haven't bought that. There's one trade you would have made in which you would have profited enormously, which was gold in like 06 or 07. If you had bought gold, you would have made a lot of money. And I missed that. I didn't get that. But what I did get was getting into stocks at the low, and the belief that the Fed's actions would not cause inflation and would not cause bond yields to rise. It hasn't happened. And people will come and tell you, just wait, it will happen. But my response to that is the idea that something bad will happen eventually is not an economic model. It's just not a way to go about walking across the street, the belief that, well, the street could eventually fall out. You've got to think about the forces that move things back and forth and that move things in a certain direction and create a model out of that. Okay, so I've taken the Fed's balance sheet from $800 billion on the way to $3 trillion. I think every economist would have told you that would create runaway inflation. It has not. We're running about 1.5 or 2% inflation. Some things higher than others, admittedly, but overall the aggregate price level, which is what inflation is, just be careful because inflation is not the rise of a single thing. It's not the rise of gasoline, it's not the rise of food. It's the rise in the aggregate price level has been relatively well contained and certainly well contained relative to the rise in the size of the balance sheet. So we're rewriting these rules, and I'm not even sure what we should write right now.
This time, let's open up the question and answer session to the audience.
Right here. I'm sorry.
One of the best exchanges between your best friend, Rick Santelli.
Uh-huh.
There must be a special relationship there. I was wondering if you could just mention a little bit about it.
So Rick and I stumbled across something that we didn't know existed. Here's how I explain it. Part of my job was to explain what the Federal Reserve does. And that doesn't necessarily mean I advocate what they do, but my job is to explain it. And what I didn't realize was that there was an awful lot of resentment to things the Fed and the government were doing at the time. And I don't think that had been given voice. And so what happened one day was I was debating with Rick this notion of should the government help underwater mortgage holders, people whose homes were worth less than the value of their mortgage. And informing my experience was 5 years I spent here in Florida as a real estate reporter, covering the Resolution Trust Corporation, where the government stepped in and ultimately resolved the real estate issue. And I thought, you know what? If we don't do something big and bold right now, this is going to linger for a long time. I would point out I was correct on that point, but that's neither here nor there. I'm not arguing with Rick now. That point unleashed the tirade that launched the Tea Party. And I don't agree with what Rick thinks about the world, and I don't mostly understand most of what he says. However, I give him enormous credit for giving voice to a sentiment that was out there in the public, and I think he's done a decent job representing that sentiment, and I have respect for him for that. I just disagree with almost everything he thinks. Sir.
I want to go back to the aging aspect. I've read in several publications there are approximately 78 million baby boomers, or boomers as they're called.
Right.
And I've read that 80% do not have defined pensions, as my
Right.
generation does.
Right.
And I've also read a Fed report that their assets, not counting their homes, many of which are underwater, their assets, 401ks, IRAs, et cetera, are in between $85,000 and $95,000. That sounds like a train wreck. What's going to happen to these 78 million boomers when 80% have no pensions?
Um,
And plus, what's going to happen to our economy?
Well, first thing I'll take the second question first. We have a huge dilemma, right, which is how we're going to take those people around the Thanksgiving dinner table who are working and pay for those who aren't. And the only way that's going to happen is if we increase the productivity of those who are working. The only way that's going to happen is if we spend money on education. We have this great culture in this country where we let immigrants come in, but economically, and I'm speaking only clinically here, so forgive the lack of humanity in my thing here, in my next statement. They're only good to us if they're productive workers. They only will increase growth if they're educated and productive. So that's clear. You think about humans in terms of capital, right? And this is just, help me, Professor, I'm right on this, right? I mean, they're machines and they're humans, and we think of them in terms of productive assets to the economy. Human capital. It's the term we use, and it's clinical and it sounds terrible, but if they can't read and they can't run a machine or they can't do accounting, it's not helping. It would be negative growth if their productivity on average is below the existing workforce. So it's no damn good to let them in if we don't educate them. And that's the only way it's going to happen. And it will happen. We can grow their productivity and we can get them to a point where they become more productive, but we've got to decide to commit to that. And I think President Obama, in something that I have heard lauded by Republicans and Democrats alike, even more so Republicans, this idea of working with the community colleges, I think makes a lot of sense. I think that's a place where we're going to do it, and lots of input into English as a second language. You know, that's critical. Okay, that's on the one hand. On the other hand, I don't know the answer to your question, how that's going to happen. It's going to hurt us. You know, the stock market comes back a little bit. That will enhance some of the wealth there. But we're going to provide, we're not going to change the benefit structure on Social Security to existing ages. The only time we do it is when we get to the year just before my age. They only talk about reducing benefits, you know, those who are 1960 or whatever it is, you know, up to 62, you're fine. Whatever it is, whatever plan anybody comes out with, you know, the Ryan plan, this plan, it's always right up to my age. And then we're going to start to cut benefits. So, and I don't know about, you know, people my age and younger, we only think about, I don't know, about there being no Social Security around at all. I mean, that's the way I think about the world. But it's a problem, and I don't know if it ultimately will result in having to increase those benefits, but it's a huge, again, it's an education issue, and I'm involved with some of this right now. There are two pieces of education here. One is educating younger people about debt, because they just don't understand it. And it's funny, it's like, I'm thinking of like a guy who's selling drugs. They know more about how to get you hooked than you know how to stay off it. And that's the way debt is for a lot. They don't understand. We promote this kind of consumer society, and we give kids credit cards, and they don't know how to use them, and they end up in debt. And so I'm involved in a bunch of projects to try to get that message out. And then the other one is savings, is trying to get people in this. I mean, I think people who are 55 and older are kind of, it's almost too late. But if you can start to do work with people in their 30s and 40s and get them to thinking about savings, and that's something you can do. But I don't have an answer to that question. I think it's a problem, and I think if we don't balance it with greater productivity on younger people, it's going to be a bigger problem.
Steve.
Sure.
There have been some suggestions that a financial transaction tax of a very, a tiny amount on each transaction would be very beneficial in protecting against the really destabilizing effect of these computer programs.
I like that idea. I keep thinking about what value these guys are adding to the economy. I mean, there gets to be a point where the argument that they add liquidity is no longer any good. I mean, I once did a calculation, and I don't remember what the numbers were, but it was something crazy. Like, I tried to figure out if Jim Simon's salary was used to employ auto workers, how many cars we could get for the salary of Jim Simons. And it was like 23 million automobiles. And so then I thought to myself, where are the 23 million automobiles that metaphorically Jim Simons is creating by trading nanosecond nano differences between baskets of 4,000 stocks? I am a free market guy on markets all the way to the end, but I don't see the value added, and maybe if you could show me that that were to add stabilization to the market, I'd be all in favor of it. I like that idea. Yeah.
You have a lot of international experience.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I was reading in the Wall Street Journal recently, the percentage of GDP that the financial sector contributes in the U.S. compared to European countries. As we're looking at Cyprus, even other countries like Luxembourg, even the stalwart of Europe, Germany. Are we waiting for another Cyprus to happen in that regard?
You mean in Europe or the United States, or what do you mean?
In the European Union, and as it would affect our economy here in the U.S.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think Europe's done yet. I mean, I think Cyprus was a specific instance where massive inflow of Russian money, and then, by the way, a little bit self-inflicted in Cyprus too. If you think about what the Europeans did, it's maybe been missed by some people that when they cut the value of Greek debt by 50%, they created a huge capital shortfall inside the Cyprus banks. So again, that was a little bit of a man-made problem. Not that Cyprus didn't go out and engage in massive money laundering where the Russians would put money into the bank and it would go right back to the Russians as a loan. And that kind of creates this issue of, I mean, I like the idea that people lost money there because I like the idea that a person looking for a tax haven has to be more concerned about the country where that money is going and the regulatory regime that oversees it. And I think one of the things that hopefully would happen as a result of silver lining on the Cyprus thing is that it creates market discipline on tax haven banks. And that maybe you decide, instead of the 5% extra, well, sometimes it's a lot more than 5%. Andy could tell me, right? How much I get from going into a tax haven over in the Caymans. No, never mind. I'm just joking, Andy, just joking. We'll talk about that later, right? Yeah. So maybe, and the possibility of getting a haircut if the banking system goes down. I mean, there was Switzerland, which had a banking system that was a multiple of its GDP. Here in the United States, it's 100%. So I think we're better in that regard. I'm not sure Europe as a monetary union is going to exist the way it is right now, 3 or 4 years from now. It doesn't make any sense. What you did is you put countries together with vastly different productivity rates and said, if we join them together, that will solve those differences and make the South more competitive. And it didn't happen. And I'm not sure it makes sense for it to be together. I think that the temperature of the world, if you were to make it into a heat map, has gone from red to kind of orange and a little bit yellow, which is cooler, because of what the European Central Bank did, which is it did step up and say, we will underpin at least some of the losses in the European banking system. So we're not going to wake up tomorrow morning and have a country go bankrupt right now. And the only reason we had this issue with Cyprus is people wanted to stick it to the Russians. So.
Yeah, I just have a question about your choice, which may be a false choice, between freeing the free market and caring for people. It seems like you're relying on government and higher taxes to do that. Doesn't freeing the market, real businesses, not just the computer traders, but freeing the real businesses with lesser taxes end up raising revenue in the long run? And can't the private sector fill in where the government's sort of failing in education and also find innovative, technologically sound ways to help the old and the poor?
I think so. I think so. And what I started off saying was that we believed in that wholly for 40 years. And my point is that there has been something of a rethinking of the most doctrinaire thinking on that issue. And I'm not sure that we believe anymore that all answers come from freeing the market or free markets. I know that for better or worse, President Obama has a different take. His take is as follows. I think this is his take. His take is, we've had a lot of free markets, and it's created this massive wealth gap out there where rich people have gotten richer and middle-class salaries have really moved at all. So I think what he thinks is what we could do is we could, maybe skip a step and go down and provide more direct training and assistance to people to lift themselves up. I'm not saying that's right or wrong, and I will point out something that's worth thinking about, that the debate we're having is between should government spending be 24% of GDP, which is it is right now, or 20% of GDP. 4 percentage points. It's kind of what separates the two extreme ends of the party. And you remember, like, Ronald Reagan was this big defense hawk, and Mondale was a dove. This was in 84 when Mondale ran? And their debate was 5 percentage points of the defense budget. One guy was calling for $500 billion, and the other guy was calling for, what was it, 490 or something like that. And I think those are legitimate and real debates, but here's how I think about government. Government is inefficient, and people complain about the government not being run like a company or not being run like a household. Well, guess what? The government is the government because it's not a company or a household. We rely specifically on the government to do certain things that companies and households won't do in certain ways. And why? And when we do that, we trade efficiency for equity. And probably the best way to think about this is Delta can have a sky priority line where it lets its first-class customers to the front of the line. But the Department of Motor Vehicles cannot have that line. Everybody gets in the same damn line and waits the same amount of time, although in fact you can do it online now, but that was a good story when I used to tell it. So government provides equity, in other words, the same service to all people regardless of wealth, regardless of their skin color or geographic location. The Postal Service is another way to think about that. Why didn't we get rid of the Postal Service and go with FedEx? We did that because people who live in rural areas would pay enormous amounts of money if they could get FedEx to even come out there. Excuse me a second. So, from an economics point of view, I am indifferent to the government providing something or the private sector providing it if you understand the cost you are paying. You will pay more for the delivery of the service. And you will pay, and it will be more inefficient, but you're getting something in return for that. You're getting equity. That's why we have the government involved in education. Yes, private sector would almost certainly provide better education to a certain number of people. But we make a decision, and we can change this decision, and you could be right, that we want to provide this education to everybody. And what we end up with is a lower mean. In other words, I think the average delivery is lower than it otherwise would be if it was just the private sector, but we would be excluding certain people. Are you good on that? That's just, it's, you know, you can answer it any way you like. You can be, yeah, I'm good on that, or I'm not good on that. But that's why it gets back to my point. These are not universal economic principles. These are cultural choices we make. And you can make whatever decision you want, but just have all the info. Okay, government is inefficient, and I want to do it more efficiently. So I'm going to move it into the private sector. What am I losing? Equity. Am I cool losing the equity? Fine. You lose it, you're good. Go on, make it a private sector. That's the way I think about it. And I think there are some things that need to be in the private sector only. In fact, we hire the government to do things that private sector won't do. the way we want them done or won't do them fast enough. That's why we have a government. And in some cases, it succeeds really well. I mean, some people say the GI Bill built the middle class in America. That was a time when we maybe had great government. I think the government did an important job in saving this country from a Great Depression in 2008. That's my opinion. If you go back and look at the 1930s, about what happened when we had a banking crisis, we had lines at at banks to get your money out, okay? We made a social choice that we did not want to live that way, that we did not want ordinary citizens in America to worry about losing their savings in banks, that we wanted to have a government-run system, essentially paid for by the banks, by the way, but organized by the government, that would insure people's deposits. So that this time around we had no lines, but we also had a TARP that had to bail out the banks. So that's, I'm sorry.
During the election year, there was election season. There was a commercial by the Hungarian immigrant.
Yeah.
Communism. I don't remember it all. You might know it better, but I just wonder what you thought of that commercial.
Sure, fine. I mean, I remember thinking that we've gotten to a point where there's no limit to the amount of money that can go into the system here politically, and I wish that wasn't the case, but it is what it is, and I think the guy had a right to his opinion. I think that there are, I really think the concerns about Obama being a socialist are overstated. I think he is a person who relies more and thinks more about government than the private sector, but I think socialist is over the top, and I wish the debate didn't polarize people in a way that could create a discussion. And I think the same is true on the Republican side, on the Democrat side for Republicans. I think that you know, the Democrats, you know, what's the word I'm looking for? They caricaturize Republicans in a way that creates we can't even have the discussion. So what he did, what's interesting is there was an initial poll that was done when Obama first came in office because he supported TARP, and the average person said that Obama's policies benefited Wall Street, and that what he was involved was bailing out the biggest banks. I thought, you know what? Pick a criticism and go with it. Either he's bailing out the banks or he's a socialist, but he can't be both. He can't be doing both. And I happen to know from firsthand that the last thing he wanted to do was come in and deal with a banking crisis and nationalize the banks. That was not what Barack Obama, the senator from Chicago, was thinking about when he's thinking about being president. I think he thought he had, like, you know, he'd play with 2% of GDP and maybe move it a little bit over to helping poor people and lower middle class people. That's what I thought he thought his presidency was going to be about. Instead, he gets in, the financial world's collapsed, and he spends the first year or 12 months or 14 months really just dealing with the financial crisis. And of course, he did Obamacare, and I feel like that was a mistake in terms of focus on the economy. He argues that there was no other time to do it if he was going to do it, and we can argue if that was the right thing to do. But he did pass the $800 billion stimulus program, which creates, by the way, the largest swing ever in GDP from negative to positive, but only gets us this bit above positive. So, and you know, we've had this sort of up and down on unemployment. It's gone down from 10% to 7.7%. We never have had the 5 or 6% GDP pop that you get a lot of times after you have a big downturn. And that's really what's been missing in this recovery and why that is.
Steve, I have two quick questions. One concerns the stock market. Now, you're among friends, so we won't hold you to this. And today, the S&P 500, as you know, closed at an all-time high. Where do we go from here? So that's question one. And question two concerns the demographic theorists. We're talking CNBC regular Harry Dent and the ilk. They're saying basically in terms of what you had earlier stated, that the population is aging, there'll be consequences, but they're talking about the dip in demand as the population ages. They point to Europe, they point to Japan, they point to emerging China. What's going to happen in terms of our society and the economy as theoretically this demand goes down?
So what was the first part of the question? The stock market. The stock market. So I consider myself essentially the janitor of CNBC. I don't, I essentially clean the toilets. I don't do stocks. Everybody else there does the stock market. I don't talk about stocks. I don't talk about the stock. The only thing I care about the stock market is there essentially a wealth effect that helps GDP and the economy grow. From what limited I know about it, it doesn't look like it's incredibly expensive relative to earnings. And we know we have the Fed with its foot on the accelerator for at least a year or more. If you get to a place where the Fed is dialing back, it's probably because there's more endogenous growth, and that should be a replacement for it. So the economy could withstand some dialing back by the Federal Reserve, and that may happen as soon as September, and the market may freak out about that a little bit initially, but if it comes back to the market in terms of earnings, I think it'll be okay. I think the economy still has some good days ahead of it. If we could remove some of the uncertainty that's out there in terms of the deficit and in terms of policy and the residual stuff from the fiscal crisis over in Europe and in the United States, I think that I look at one level. One level is important to me as to whether or not stocks are too expensive and that there's a bubble in stocks. Last I checked, the real, in other words, inflation-adjusted return on the 10-year yield is still negative. So let's think about that for a second. Investors in the United States and around the world are willing to give the U.S. government money and receive a negative return when adjusted for inflation. And even if I don't give you the inflation argument, all you're getting is 1.85% over 10 years. What that tells me is there's still an awful lot of money crawled up underneath a rock with its tail between its legs because it's really scared of the world. As long as that rate remains negative or substantially around zero, or even a little bit above zero, it tells me there's a lot of room for stocks to do well, because there's a lot of money that probably should be in riskier assets that isn't. And there is support in the market from that money moving over into the stock market. If this rate were at a rate that would challenge or compete with stocks, it'd be a different story. But you cannot give the government money and receive a competitive inflation-adjusted risk-free return of 3%, but you can in certain dividend stocks, right? I mean, there are certain stocks that are out there where you can get a decent rate and get appreciation upside. So to me, it seems like it's a pretty good deal right now, especially with the Fed on your side. As for the aging of the population, I don't have a good answer for it. I mean, I think there are issues out there. You will have fewer people working, but they're also, by the way, the last I checked, it may not be the same number again, but there's $7 trillion in bequest out there from one generation to the next. So there is wealth. It may not be well spread, what you were talking about, the average thing, but there's an enormous amount of wealth out there that's going to pass from one generation to the next that will be unleashed or unlocked at some point in time, that is part of what will help the economy out. But the best guess right now, and this is where you want to engage your economics professor here, because she's the real deal, I'm just a journalist here, is that we're going to live not as well because we're going to have this decline in productivity. You know that calculating growth in this country is the easiest thing you could possibly do. You need just two numbers: growth in hours worked and growth in productivity. Those two numbers equals GDP. It's just that if you could tell me what productivity is going to be or what hours work is going to be, you just can't know it, right? And And even when you do know it, it's subject to being revised. But those are the two things that go into how much we worked and how much we increased our efficiency. That's all of growth. That's all it is. So it may sound naive or whatever you want to call it, Pollyannish, that I think we're going to increase our productivity to match the need to increase it, but we'll become more efficient as we have to handle and pay for the aging of the population, but it's going to be a challenge and a struggle. I'm just not going to get myself that pessimistic about that issue right now.
Steve, if we could have one more quick question, and then Steve will be around here after we conclude the program in case you wanted to ask him questions personally that you were afraid to ask in front of your economics professor. So if
How about in the back there? Did you have a question there? Sure. I didn't say he embraces his father's belief, I don't think. Did I say that? Okay. But if you have another question. What's that, sorry? So that's a really good question. That's a really good question. The question was, what are we doing? What did we do before? Well, first of all, we didn't have as many older people. People weren't living as long. That was the other thing. We also had a lot more kids, and those kids supported their parents. But one of the really weird things about human beings that we found is that as they get wealthier, they have fewer kids. You'd think from an evolutionary standpoint, the fact that you could support more of the passing along of your genes, you do more of that, but you don't. You do the opposite. Every single wealthy population in existence, or every time it ages, fertility rates decline. We're not really sure why, but in general, what the social scientists say is that we tend to invest more in quality of children rather than quantity of children. We pay for their education more, we make sure they're healthier, and the decision we make is to have fewer kids. The other thing that happens, and it's not entirely clear why, is that as societies get wealthier, they tend to ask their governments to do more. We ask for governments to provide more services, either because we believe we can afford it or for some other reason that's unknown, but it's another thing we've seen in every society out there. There's two benefits to having government-run social programs. And we see this very keenly in China. If you have to save for your retirement by yourself, you will reduce your spending now and increase your savings for the future. And that means that you have no internal consumption. And one of the good things about this country is we have incredible amounts of internal consumption. We are a hugely consumer-driven society, and that's part of the strength of the society. And one of the reasons people can consume now is because they know that at least certain parts of their retirement are paid for. There will be some benefit from the government. Has it gone overboard? Have we now promised more than we can deliver? Probably. Will that benefit be dialed back? Almost certainly. But will we ask certain Americans to pay more to pay for that? Yes. And that's what's going to happen. Whether or not we end up kicking and screaming and dragged to that compromise point, I don't know. But I think we can get there faster or get there sooner. There's going to be some rise in taxes and some reduction in benefits. Everybody knows that's true. And why the parties can't get there, I don't know.
Thank you,
My
Mr.
pleasure.
Liesman.
Thank you.
We have a small gift for you as a token of our appreciation.
I hope it's a T-shirt.
Filled with, I think there's one in there.
I have one of the great T-shirt collections of all times, and it will be my pleasure to proceed. Look at that.
There you go.
Awesome. Thank you.
And we're going to give Andy one to match
Good.
you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.